Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the Sejong Institute's online seminar. And I really appreciate that you're joining us early in the morning in Seoul and late evening in Washington, D.C. And my name is Woo Jung-yeop. I'm the VP for the Research and Planning of the Sejong Institute. And at the same time, I'm the director of the Center for the American Studies here at the Sejong Institute. Today, I invite like 6 panelists to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on the global security and the Korean Peninsula. I will briefly introduce our panelists today. For our American panelists in the alphabetical order, we have Dr. Patrick Cronin of Hudson Institute, Dr. Patricia Kim of USIP, and Dr. Mike O'Hanlon from the Brookings. And from Korean side, in the Canada order, Korean alphabetical order, we have Director General Go Yun-ju, Professor Baek Woo-yeol of Yonsei University, and Professor Jo Dong-jun of Seoul National University. And for today's meeting, that I gave 2 leading questions to our panelists. Since the relations between US and China has been worsened with the COVID-19, it looks like that COVID-19 worsened or exacerbated the relations between 2 countries even worse. So where is this heading? And the second question was that is so-called new Cold War inevitable? And then is South Korea inevitably dragged into the new Cold War? Then what would be the role of ROK-US alliance? So without a further ado, that I would like to ask Dr. O'Hanlon to give his initial speech for about 5 minutes. Please, Mike.
Thank you. Greetings, everyone. It's wonderful to be together, even though it's a difficult moment. Although Koreans give us hope because you are such excellent allies, because you have started your baseball season, which gives everyone inspiration, because you have found a way to deal with COVID-19, which shows the remarkable resilience and cohesion and ingenuity of your country. And we're all trying to learn from you here in the United States. And I say that partly as a way of welcome and well, grateful appreciation that you're including me and welcoming us, but also it's a little bit of a metaphor for the theme I want to introduce tonight, because I believe that the Republic of Korea's role in global politics is in some sense a broader manifestation of the same kinds of dynamics we're seeing now. Because I think in many ways, to start with your second question, that South Korea's role in the US-China relationship will be as important as any other country's in figuring out if we can find a way to reach a new equilibrium, which is probably more difficult and more tense and in some ways more adversarial with China, but still is reasonable, still is under wraps, still is in some sense well managed and contained within certain bounds of behavior, or whether the relationship will go off the tracks into extreme rivalry. And frankly, I believe Americans need to listen to Koreans on this topic as much as the other way around, because South Korea, of course, more than any other country, has the most powerful incentives to get along with both the United States and China. And I think you're always going to be seen as a country that's very proud, very strong, very cohesive, but also recognizes that it's a relatively small country in a region of great powers. Korea is not just a minnow in a sea of sharks. That metaphor is not right, because Korea is much, much more than a minnow. As we know, it's the 11th largest economy on Earth. I think it's one of the 5 best militaries on the planet. And I think it's also, for the United States, one of the 2 or 3 most important allies we have in the whole world at trying to figure out how to deal with a rising China. So in answer to your second question, please don't let us drag you into a Cold War against your own will. We need to listen to you as much as you need to listen or be influenced by us. And I think one of the challenges for Americans in the next 10 to 20 years is going to be working with South Korean friends to figure out how to find a new normal, a new equilibrium in a relationship with China that's becoming more difficult and will be more difficult. Whether President Trump or Vice President Biden wins the election in November, we will have a more difficult relationship with China than we did 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. But there's still the question, can we find a way towards a semi-stable, tense, but still productive relationship? And there, I think South Korea can help us avoid that new Cold War. Just one comment on COVID-19, and then I will stop for now, because I know you asked really more for an initial comment or provocation rather than a speech, and wanted us to stay within 6 minutes or even less. And what I would say, and I'll look forward to hearing what others on the panel will say themselves, is that in some ways, COVID-19 is a perfect microcosm of what China is today, because China did cause the problem. It was because of poor Chinese hygiene and poor Chinese dealings with open markets in all likelihood, or at least some of the broader questions of how China's been urbanizing and modernizing. That's probably what led to the mutation of this virus into something that could be lethal to people. And we also know China was not forthcoming in the first month, which was a crucial month. So China is not going to come out of this looking very good. On the other hand, China has also shown that it's capable of perhaps dealing with this kind of an outbreak, maybe even better than my country in some ways, once the outbreak already happened, through a very strong and autocratic state, but also through some good policies on public health. And we have to acknowledge that China is going to be recognized as achieving certain things that we in the United States and Italy and Spain and Britain and France did not achieve so successfully. So it's sort of a perfect metaphor for the complexity of the new world, in which even countries that are wary of China, and I think most countries are wary of China, they will still be looking also at China's strengths and trying to find that new relationship that's going to be more complicated than how the world dealt with China or the Soviet Union in the Cold War. China's not going to be just the good guy or the bad guy. They're going to be the good, the bad, and the ugly all together. And it's going to be complicated. So in that sense, COVID-19 sort of shows the worst and the best of China, which I think is sort of in that sense, what we're all going to be dealing with for many years to come. So I think I'll leave it at that and look forward to the comments of other colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Next, Professor Jo Dong-jun, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm really happy to have this opportunity of sharing insight. I'd like to bring 3 points. First, I'd like to bring your attention to the domestic trend in both countries. In the United States, President Trump represents conservative anti-globalization sentiment, and Senator Sani Sanders represent progressive anti-globalization trend. So even though there are some discourse difference between two political figures, I think they both are similar in terms of the anti-globalization. So it means the 2 major political parties in the United States have already had a strong anti-globalization sentiment. It means anti-globalization and China basin have been already there in the United States. So if you look at the Chinese side, you're going to see the strong nationalistic sentiment too. So I'm afraid the rapid economic success usually goes with the surge of the nationalistic sentiment. As China's economy is getting stronger, China's nationalist sentiment will go on too. So the strong Chinese nationalist sentiment have been a source of discord between 2 countries. And second, I'd like to bring your attention to the interaction between domestic politics and the starting point of the Cold War in the late 1940s. The partisan politics in the United States was somewhat related with the start of the Cold War. Some political leaders in the United States aggravate the threat perception toward the Soviet Union. Soviet Union side, the similar phenomenon happened. So leaders in the Soviet Union exacerbated their threat perception toward the United States for some political purposes. So it means the partisan politics in both countries in the late 1940s contributed to the starting of the Cold War. And third, probably the strategic value of North Korea will go down because of the COVID-19. The North Korean tourism is not attractive any longer, and the labor forces in North Korea is not attractive any longer because the global supply chain is disrupted. So it means North Korean maneuver room, the maneuver room for North Korea will decrease very much because of the COVID-19. So this is what I like to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Joe. And now, Dr. Patricia Kim. Patricia, please.
Thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's wonderful to see colleagues from the Sejong Institute as well as DC colleagues and friends on this call. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So to get right to the question that we were asked to cover on whether COVID-19 has exacerbated US-China tensions and whether we're entering into a new Cold War, I would start by noting that US-China bilateral relations have been on a downward trajectory for several years now, and the COVID-19 outbreak essentially accelerated this downturn. The Chinese government's mishandling of the outbreak has deepened existing mistrust that many US policymakers, experts, and the general public now have of the PRC's political system. In fact, recent polls show that American citizens' views of China have reached unprecedented lows. So as such, I don't see US-China relations improving anytime soon, even after the pandemic subsides, for several reasons. First, many of the issues that have troubled the relationship far precede the virus, with concerns about trade and the Chinese economic system, its increasingly aggressive stance in Hong Kong and Taiwan, Beijing's political system and human rights records, and so on. These are just a few of the areas where the United States and China have fundamental differences and are unlikely, therefore, to see eye to eye anytime soon. Second, leaders in both the United States and China have greater incentive to embrace hardline stances toward each other in the near term, with the November elections around the corner in the United States, and Beijing, on the other hand, feeling both internal and external pressure from the COVID-19 outbreak and its consequences. So to go into a bit more detail on Beijing's predicament, China's economy shrunk by 6.8% in the first quarter of 2020. This is the first time that the Chinese economy has contracted in decades. And this downturn has precisely come at the year that Xi Jinping promised would be the one where China would eradicate poverty and build what he has called a moderately prosperous society. And this was one of the first steps in Beijing's campaign to become a true great power by 2049. So Xi Jinping and the CCP will face a great test over the next few months to deliver economic recovery at home and get back on track. At the same time, Beijing is facing great pressure from the international community due to the pandemic and questions about how it handled the viral outbreak. Since emerging from the worst of its own outbreak, China has stepped up its efforts to turn the focus around from its initial cover-up of the pandemic at home and to position itself as a leader in fighting COVID-19. Having said that, China has far from fully recovered its global image. So last week, Beijing finally agreed to participate in an international investigation at the WHO into the pandemic, after facing great pressure by the United States, Australia, Europe, and many other countries for a global inquiry. There are also questions about what will happen to China's Belt and Road Initiative and all the massive investments and infrastructure projects that Beijing created around the world that are now sitting there with a looming global recession. Beijing is actually facing great pressure by developing countries in places like Africa to forgive the billions of dollars of loans that they've taken on from China over the course of years. And it remains to be seen how China will handle these demands from the international community, as well as its citizens at home who are wondering, what were our leaders doing spending all this money abroad? And of course, there's the biggest piece of news this week with Hong Kong and Beijing facing pressure from the United States and other democratic governments for the new national security law that it's imposing on the island. So we could talk about that a bit later. But all of this is to say that the CCP is facing great pressure from both the outside and inside, and therefore it will not want to be seen as weak or compromising, and therefore it is likely to embrace a more nationalistic and hardline stance in the coming months and years. So to get to the second part of the question, will we witness a new Cold War, and what is the ROK-US alliance and South Korea's role in this potential new Cold War? I don't think anyone in the US has called for an outright Cold War with China. And in fact, many American analysts have warned that stumbling into one is not a good idea. Nevertheless, I think we will see a greater push for decoupling with China in certain areas, especially the tech sector and the medical supply chain and so on. And I think this will create both opportunities and generate pressure on US allies and partners like South Korea. Now, it's certainly understandable that these allies, including Seoul, fear being pulled into a new Cold War, since South Korea, like other countries in Asia, count on China as a major trade partner. They can't afford to fully decouple with or alienate Beijing. And South Korea especially has experienced the pain of China's economic retaliation in the past. So I completely understand the fears that are lingering in Seoul. But so what role can South Korea play as the United States ally, as the US-China relationship goes through this downturn? So I would say first, rather than worrying about choosing between Washington and Beijing, I think Seoul should embrace a leadership role in upholding democracy in its neighborhood by broadcasting to those around the region and the international community that it will continue to take a confident, consistent, and principled approach that prioritizes democracy, transparency, freedom of navigation, and other values that South Koreans, just as much as Americans, Australians, Japanese, and others cherish. I think demonstrating to China and the rest of the world that South Korea will stand firm on its own democratic principles, not as a favor to anyone, but rather for the sake of its own national interests and values, is the strongest message that Seoul could send. In addition to messaging, there are many practical ways I think South Korea could play a leadership role by helping build capacity, strengthen civil society, and democratic norms around the region. For instance, as Michael pointed out, South Korea has truly done a remarkable job of tracking the coronavirus and utilizing technology to control the pandemic, all under a democratic framework. So I could see South Korea playing a significant role in the region, helping train and build capacity and serving as a model on how to be a highly networked, technologically capable, and democratic state. So I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And now I turn to Professor Bae-Guyul, please.
Okay, thanks for inviting me for a very interesting webinar over here. Number one question is, has COVID-19 exacerbated the US-China relations? Can the relationship recover? Of course, it's COVID-19 accelerated the US-China relations deterioration, much more than we expected. But it's not a new phenomenon, as I think it's Dr. Patricia Kim, said. It's a process has been accelerated, 재수화, 가속화 in Korean, by 5 or 10 years. And China might want you to wait, 5 to 10 years, a little more. Because China needed a little bit more time, to compete with the United States. And at the same time, China insiders say it's a little bit hard for them, to figure it out, what to do with this, accelerated, process. So we will see the exacerbation of the United States-China relationship, but it's up to how to define the recovery of this relationship. It's going to be pretty hard, but it is dichotomous. It's not going to be happening, but it's a matter of degree. Of course, it can be recovering, but as the grand trend is going to be down, as the other three professors and then doctors said, and then we will see it's going to be the deterioration of the divided relationship quite a lot. But we witnessed, the new Cold War. Yeah, a new Cold War, but much warmer one though. I mean, as we know, it is quite different from the United States and Soviet Union type of, Cold War. It is, tightly intertwined with each other in many, perspectives, especially economic and technology, and then political and even cultural, dimensions too. But the Cold War is going to be not just the United States versus, China. It's more like the West versus, China. And then, as we know, the European Union raised raised the question about China's role and China's influence to themselves. And then the United States is going to is being the bipartisan to contain or constrain China. So it's more like in the West. The United States alone cannot constrain China. I think it's the critical understanding or recognition of from both sides. China already knew that the United States cannot constrain China alone, and then China actually tried to have its own blocks too. So, but the thing is, the global strategic environment is quite different from the previous eras of the global confrontation. The middle powers, so-called middle powers, as the Dr. O'Hanlon and Cronin and Dr. Cho and then Kim said, it's quite different. Okay, the middle powers like China, South Korea, and then Japan, and then France, and the UK, and Indonesia, and then India, and then Brazil, and then those countries are much stronger and then connected than before. Not just Europe, one more time, it's but Asia and other parts of the world. So the new Cold War is going to be quite different, from what we witnessed and learned from the previous experience. If so, will South Korea be dragged into a new Cold War between the United States and China? Yeah, of course. South Korea will drag into a new Cold War, but one more time, it's quite different type of Cold War, and then warmer Cold War. And then South Korea will resist as much as possible. I mean, as we know, South Korea, tried to strike a balance between the United States and China. The United States is military ally, and then South Korea has a lot of good relations with the United States in the last 70 years, and it's ally. But at the same time, China has been very important for South Korea's prosperity, economic development, and sustainable economic development is almost impossible without China's rise and China's economic development. So at the same time, China is very important for South Korea to deal with North Korea, as we know. Of course, it has been not very good, not very productive, but still China is the most important factor for containing or constraining North Korea too. Of course, the United States is ally though. Okay. So it's a quite different situation one more time, and then not very good situation for the middle powers like South Korea. The question of the moment of truth, 진실의 순간 in Korean, the moment of truth to choose whether the United States or China. I think this question has been around, I think, last 10 years in South Korea, policy community and the media. But I think the moment of truth it's not going to come pretty soon, and it's not just for South Korea. It's just for, and not only just for South Korea, but also for any other middle powers. And the middle powers, as I said, is much stronger, much connected, and they are capable of dealing with this bilateral confrontation between the United States and China, and then either one side say you must choose us, the United States or China, then these countries will resist. And then if the China or the United States push them too hard, then it's going to backfire them. Okay, so that's the so the moment of truth is not going to come pretty soon. Unlike many policy analysts and then said. And then before we have to think about the South Korea wanted to enter the big boys game even before this COVID-19 happening. The good evidence is the New Southern Policy. New Southern Policy actually is want to go beyond the Northeast Asia and Korean Peninsula. It's entering big boys game. So South Korea need to choose one way or the other. Say accelerate the process of the going into the big boys game with this new southern policy type of the strategies, or just back down and then just insulate itself from the big boys game in Korean Peninsula. That actually is the key for South Korea. One last comment is the United States and China do not look like the world leader at this moment in multiple perspectives. China is not a leader, and the United States was a leader, but it's not look like leader this at the time. And then there's influence and the power is slightly going down. And then South Korea and then most European countries, especially West European countries and Nordic countries, and might have a consensus to this type of argument that there is no leader. South Korea have a G2 or G0 type of argument in policy community in the media, but it look like more G0. So meaning that of course these two blocks is going to be emerging and formulating, but at the same time those middle powers and try to be independent between these two, and then have this two-layered relationship. Okay, I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Park. Now I ask Dr. Cronin. Patrick, please.
Well, thank you very much. What a great discussion that the Sejong Institute has put together virtually, and I'm delighted to join you. In March, I forecast that the COVID-19 would accelerate a pre-existing US-China geopolitical competition. And I'd assert now that this competition is still further likely to intensify, as my colleagues have already suggested, but I do think it's going to be short of becoming a new Cold War. Now, this judgment does not in any way detract from how critical it is to contain the coronavirus. Every country is affected by this pandemic. The deaths of 100,000 Americans can already be linked to this disease, and it's only 3 months in for the United States. A vaccine's not expected at least until next year. The global economy is teetering on recession. If we just step back for a minute from foreign policy talk and we look at the global pandemic, it very much highlights our human interconnectedness. It's the very essence of our shared human condition. Microbes have been a momentous factor throughout world history. And it's giving interstate competition a run for its money right now today. But a once-in-a-century pandemic, it does just underscore that we're all dealing with the same science, the same public health systems globally, not big power rivalry. And I think, as my colleagues have said, South Korea has given us an exemplary model for testing and tracking that I hope all of us will learn from. And at the human level, there are so many people who are just struggling for survival. For those on the front lines fighting this disease as well. And I was at the hospital just twice in the last couple of days with family. It's also a time for acts of courage and selflessness. And even for those who are relatively safe and practicing social distancing, it's not business as usual. But these brutal realities don't change also the realities of interstate competition. Despite an overlapping international interest in defeating COVID-19, the pandemic is actually raising new questions about foreign policy, about globalization, about the truthfulness of authoritarian regimes, about how democratic governments balance the needs of security with the aspirations for freedom and prosperity. US-China relations are inseparable from peace and security globally, regionally, and on the peninsula. Unfortunately, the acceleration of US-China rivalry is failing to produce an intelligent consensus here in America over an effective response. Extreme voices are drowning out sensible views. And at one end of the spectrum, some argue that we are indeed already in a new Cold War. And at the other, there are those who still appear to assume that if we go back to trade and engagement as it was, it will magically produce a win-win relationship. It won't. We are in a competition with China, as I think Michael O'Hanlon and Patty both made clear. It's a competition that has long historical antecedents. We cannot undo China's century of humiliation, but the PRC under Xi Jinping seems bent on, if not revenge, then a trajectory that should worry us all. We cannot ignore the imposition of surveillance state oppression. We cannot ignore the de facto annexation of the South China Sea. We cannot ignore the persistent push for a Sino-centric rule set. We've invested too much in the post-World War II order to throw it all away. But we also must find ways to work with China. There is no immaculate decoupling of our economies, and global issues like the pandemic remind us that there are serious matters that require cooperation. Now, fortunately, it's a bounded competition, not a Thucydides trap. Nuclear-armed great powers are not heading into open war, and the world's two largest economies cannot sever all their ties without doing more harm than good. The bad news is that this competition is unlikely to diminish anytime soon. To move forward, our grand strategy and world order will require less dogmatic ideology and more agility. Any China strategy that fails to address the CCP's coercive policies or fails to enumerate a theory of victory short of war or surrender is hardly a design for a brighter future. We need to continue to build comprehensive strength in concert with allies like the Republic of Korea to blunt aggression, to counter malign interference. But we also need to work with democratic South Korea and other like-minded countries to preserve open commerce and the free flow of ideas. Americans understand that Korea's economy would be unrecognizable if it failed to trade with China. But I don't think South Koreans are ready to return to a tributary system, to forgo democratic rights like free speech, or to funnel all their big data into the Ministry of State Security in Beijing. Smart disentanglement and diversification is required to retain the independence and strategic autonomy we have all come to enjoy. And as for the alliance, it endures as it has, as a circuit breaker on a renewed conflict on the peninsula, and as a crucible for shared interests and values. While we focus this discussion on China, it's worth noting that a full 70 years after North Korea invaded South Korea, Pyongyang continues to build up its nuclear missile arsenal. Alliances have always struggled to balance between the twin fears of entrapment and abandonment. But the ROK-US alliance, an alliance based on clear common interests and values, is more important today than it has ever been, and it demands wise leadership to preserve it and adapt it for the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now I turn to Director General Go. Mr. Go, please.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to these fascinating discussions. It is my pleasure to join this discussion with a familiar expert on this issue, and as well as the administration. I think since I'm the working level diplomat, I'm more like try to see the opportunity in a crisis. So my comment will be simple. More like focusing on where the diplomatic space between under the situation of the competition between the United States and China is located. So my focus is more like creating the diplomatic space to bring the United States and China to move forward to the more cooperation. So my observation is that we are witnessing day by day that competing elements rather than cooperating elements of the relations between the United States and China is more revealing at the current political season of the two countries. As you see, now China is having the two important political sessions in Beijing, and also the United States is run up to the election this November. So I think this high season of politics, necessitate that nobody want to be seen weakness to the general public. So I think this kind of situation negatively affects the cooperation of the United States and China, including for the global, existing many global issues, including the COVID-19, which requires the whole international joint efforts to overcome. So as I told you, the COVID-19, that the fundamental trait of the issue is that it requires international cooperation that nobody can solve by themselves to address this issue. So that is ultimately leading to the cooperation to solve that issue. I think that is the reality that we have to recognize humbly. This is a starting point where we have to move forward to address and bring the United States and China to move forward for cooperation. So that is my first point, that that is a reality. That is a point that we have to humbly recognize the necessity of cooperation to deal with the COVID-19 for the benefits of everybody. Having said that, my second point is that how the Korea can play a role to bring the United States and China to move forward for cooperation. I think I believe there is the unique role that Korea can play. I think that is the first that kind of a role that Korea can play stems from the Korea's status in the global affairs. Korea is geographically located between the continent and the sea. And as we know, Korea is an ally, strong ally of the United States. The alliance is the backbone of the security of the Korean Peninsula. And also, the Korea is a small trading nation. We have a very strong economic interactions with China because of this close location and mutual, beneficial regular economic development. And also, the Korea is a strong middle power country with a strong economy and democracy. Having said that, with the background of the Korea's status in the global affairs, I think in relation to the competition between China and the United States, I believe at this point of time, Korea, can provide a platform which they bring the United States and China to move forward more close to the cooperation in two areas. First area, I believe, is that the international cooperation in COVID-19. As you know, Korea, everybody speaks highly of the Korea's effective response to the fighting against the COVID-19. So everybody wants to learn from us how we address that issue, and then our experience, our knowledge. I think that makes Korea give us the competing power to lead international platform or host a platform to bring the more international, joint efforts to address that issue. So in that case, Korea, hosting a platform to address COVID-19 could contribute to the bringing the United States and China to engage in scientific and problem-solving mode of communication rather than blaming each other. So that is one area that Korea can play a role. And the other area that I think we can play a role in bringing the United States and China to move forward for cooperation is the issue of the Korean Peninsula peace process. As you know, the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula is everybody's interest. So the now North Korea takes wait and see approach, neither responding to Korea and the United States dialogue initiative, nor making any disruptive strategic provocation, such as ICBM moves. So this isolating attitude is being reinforced by the COVID-19 because they are closing the border with China and they're making their economy worsening further. So in that situation, Korea and the United States already offered their willingness to cooperate with North Korea to fight against the COVID-19. And also, as we see in last January, we proposed to North Korea that three types of cooperation initiatives: regular connection at DMZ, international peace zone, establishment of those peace zone in DMZ, and also the mutual visit by the tourists and the separated families. So I believe those are the improvement of the North-Korea relations issue can be play a role between the United States and China and to move forward to cooperation in both interests of the region. So as from the beginning, as I said, our government is trying to find the opportunity in the crisis of under the situation of the escalated competition of the United States and China by providing a platform where both two countries can work together. My name is David, and I look forward to the following discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Go. Now I am going to ask a question to our American panelists first, and please answer in a brief manner. That we are discussing the strategic competition between the United States and China, and how the COVID-19 has exacerbated the cases in the relations of two. And one of the over the last weekend that surprises many Korean audiences was that the so-called like economic prosperity network, which was not that familiar with to the Korean audiences. So during the like original Cold War period, the choice was obvious and very explicit, and there was not much interactions from like South Korea with the like Soviet bloc countries. But since 1990, that many countries have established and have interacted with China. So now it's more than like 30 years. So how US is going to push this like EPN, Economic Prosperity Network, and the like 5G clean path, and what is the goal of pushing forward this kind of like policy goals, and like how far would US go with this kind of policies? So why don't we start from Patrick for this?
Well, briefly, it's a serious issue, but I'm not sure how seriously we're organized to implement this policy. Let's be frank. For instance, consider the Blue Dot Network that was rolled out rather hastily in response to the Belt and Road Initiative that Dr. Patricia Kim was talking about, to try to be a good housekeeping seal of approval or disapproval, if you will, before countries took opaque grants or loans from China. It's really not developed very far. So this is a very serious issue. It's not going away. I believe the United States will have to work with like-minded countries, including South Korea, to protect critical technologies and information, but we have a long way to go. And it's going to have to be a lot of give and take, a lot of serious experts, both from the government and private sector, sitting down, thinking through specifically what makes sense and what can we do, what can we live with and what can't we abide, and making hard choices. So we have a long way to go, but we can see this is the beginning of that process.
Thank you, Patrick. Patricia, please.
Well, I think Patrick covered it very well. I think I haven't seen too many details yet on the EPN. It's still very much in formulation, just like the Blue Dot Network, as Patrick mentioned. I think that both initiatives were born out of a recognition that the United States and its allies need to be coordinating together to compete with China as it grows its economic influence around the world. And also the COVID-19 crisis has obviously exacerbated or accelerated this push for the United States to have independent supply chains and medical supplies, for instance. Many people were shocked after COVID-19 to hear that many of US critical medical supplies are produced solely by China. Many medical supplements, vitamins, all of that, many of that is produced solely by China. And this raised a lot of concern. And so I think this accelerated the push for the United States to look for ways to bring back certain industries back home, or to work with allies or friendly countries to make sure that supply chains are protected. Having said that, it's still not clear how exactly to coordinate this. There's a lot of concern with countries around the world like South Korea and what this means for them and how they're expected to participate. I think we're still hammering out the details and striking the right balance, not just doing a cold decoupling or not just being complacent either. I think striking the right balance, finding the right balance and working with allies and preserving some ties with China will be necessary going forward.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. Mike, please.
Yeah, I think Patricia and Patrick said it very well. I'll just add 2 points. One is I think we can all throw away our econometrics and economics 101 textbooks. Macroeconomics, the way it was taught, it said that it doesn't matter where things are made as long as the manufacturing is efficient and plays to the relative strengths of each country. That was always a little bit of a naive argument, and it's never going to be accepted the same way again. So I hope that students around the world and policymakers will essentially look for a more sophisticated and nuanced version of how to think about free trade. We cannot allow ourselves to have a dependency on a country that is becoming in many ways adversarial, even if it's not an enemy. And that leads to the second point, which is we have to imagine what could happen in a serious security or economic crisis in which both sides, let's say the democracies versus China, are escalating up the economic warfare ladder. And the question is, who is going to cry uncle first? Who needs the other side more, or who needs the other side so much that it simply cannot tolerate an ongoing process of boycotting or other kinds of economic reprisals? We need more resilience against possible Chinese economic warfare in the areas of our economy where we cannot afford to do without the things that China produces. So Japan started to learn this 10 years ago with rare earth metals over the Senkaku dispute. We're now learning it about COVID-19. A couple of years ago, to his credit, President Trump, a person I don't usually compliment, but he was, I think, correctly realizing that in the whole 5G space, we could not develop dependencies on China. So we're going to have to think through, as Patrick and Patricia and others have said, all the different areas of our economic interaction. We don't need to decouple in every way, but we need resilience so that if you can imagine yourself in an economic warfare contingency with China, you do not give Beijing the upper hand and the ability to essentially coerce us into crying uncle. That's the fundamental question. And I think it's going to ripple through, and it's going to have to be applied. That question is going to have to be applied and answered for all different sorts of economic sectors. In some areas, it won't matter that much. Doesn't matter that much if I can buy a new television next month or next year. But in other areas, medicine, high-tech components for electricity production or military equipment, 5G networks on which we all depend and which can provide ways for an adversary to listen to what we're doing inside of our own economies and our own societies. Those areas matter a lot. And we're going to have to rethink the whole relationship, because economics 101, the way it used to be taught and conceptualized, I think is sort of done for good.
Thanks, Michael. And now I'm going to ask questions to our Korean participants. And I think it is agreed by our panelists this morning that the relations between the US and China has been exacerbated. But at the same time that COVID-19, though it is very tragic to the humankind, but it gave some room of opportunity for countries like South Korea to take a leading role in the global community. So now the question is, if South Korea can play some kind of role in the global community with the like this kind of trans-border crisis, then how can South Korea and other countries mitigate the worsened tension between the two great powers, like the United States and China, or like taking a leading role in getting rid of COVID-19, or some kind of this kind of functional approach can mitigate the tensions between two great powers? Why don't we start from Dr. Beck?
Okay, but I would like to say that, South Korea need to be a little bit cautious, in reading, so resuming the leading role, for this, say, decreasing the pressure from the United States versus, China competition, by, taking a role one more time, to have some sort of a multilateral or unilateral, relationship, or convening the convention for the cooperation. K-quarantine, I know that the South Korean government and every branch actually is, out there, to so promote and then improve so-called, South Korea's middle power and a soft power, of course, and then doing a lot of, public diplomacy. And I think it's pretty important, and then it's very meaningful. But at the same time, South Korea step into, that type of role then it's going to be, heavy responsibility, to deal with the United States and China at the same time. So what I want to say is, one more time, this is two block, and then there is a, independent block, among those, middle powers, then might be, working, and then, to drag into, drag into the United States and China later, then might be, working. So it is very important for South Korea to be aware of this. Of course, it's a big opportunity, for improving South Korea's soft power, eventually, state capacity, but at the same time, it's a lot of responsibility. One more thing to remember, is K quarantine. If we South Korea say promote this K quarantine and then go into the K democracy, that might be very dangerous, for South Korea. Of course, democracy is going to be will be there, and then the basic value, and then may our American colleagues say like-minded countries. Of course, that's very important, and then it will be there. But at the same time, it's K quarantine and K democracy, and then China's governance and on the COVID-19, they might be amalgamated in the later on, but at the same time it is basic difference in the political system and political value, right? And then so South Korea has a daunting task to mix this type of values and then governance and the political system to move forward, have that type of leading role in the and then making some sort of cooperative regime among the multilateral and minilateral format.
Thank you, Dr. Baek. Professor Zhou, please.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm a little bit pessimistic about the Korean role in this situation. Probably the domestic politics in major power will determine the international order. So probably there are some pros and cons of globalization. So at this point, the negative aspect of the globalization is more, I could say it's exaggerated. So probably in the long term, people will realize the positive aspect of the globalization. As already some panelists mentioned, in some areas like sensitive technology and medicine, where we're going to see decoupling, but in most part, probably we may see the globalization, even though we experienced the COVID-19. So in the long term, the globalization will find some equilibrium point. So at this stage, while the South Korean role will be limited, probably the best way, maybe some public diplomacy, try to, catering to domestic audience and try to explain some positive of the globalization and international interaction. So probably South Korean role would be quite limited at this stage.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. Mr. Ko, please.
Yes, just going to directly how the Korea can play a role in that issue, I'd like to make some comment on the previous American colleagues' comment on the decoupling issue. My question is about the decoupling is about the force. I mean, is that possible through the market force or the political force? It seems everybody talked about the decoupling. Usually, regional economy integration is done by the free trade agreement, so-called like multilateral economic agreements. This is bringing the market force to integrate all the economies in the agreements in the parties. So, not talking about those strong economic tools about making the economic integration on regional basis, just talking about the political will to decouple some parts of the economy out of the world. I think we have to more focus on the momentum and the real force of the thing that making that kind of things happen. So in that case, if we try to focusing on the TPP, maybe in the TPP membership, regional areas, there are global supply chain, those things are readjusted, reorganized within that group. So naturally, it leading to the kind of global supply chain recoupling from the center of China. And so we more like focusing on the details of the decoupling issue and what makes decouple, make it happen in the real world. And we have to more like talk about the utility of the multilateral trade agreements. This is my point. And then regarding the Korea's role, I mean, I already talked about the two areas of the cooperation that Korea can uniquely play a role. One is in relation to COVID-19. I don't know how how much Korea can play a leading role, but Korea has soft power, and Korea have the power to convene those international multilateral fora to discuss that issue, because Korea is spoken by many countries, highly spoken by many countries as an exemplary to fight against COVID-19 very effectively. So in that case, we share the experience and the knowledge with the other countries, and then we provide a platform where the China and the United States experts discuss that the origin of outbreak on the scientific basis, and then how to fight against the future, the emergence of similar pandemic. I mean, those kind of the discussions and the channel of the communication that Korea has play a leading role. I mean, can be one contribution by middle country Korea, and then being a soft power on the COVID-19 issue that can play. And the other one is really if we want to lead an issue that we have to really actively engage. I mean, I think the one issue that we actively engage as a core party is the Korean Peninsula issue. So Korean Peninsula, I mean, that is located between China and the United States, and the choke point of the two countries. So the peace and stability of the Korean Peninsula is everybody's interest, especially China and the United States. They are really engaging in the discussions and making not those who are making further provocations, and then providing some environment and create some environment for further engaging with Korea in dialogue and bringing that negotiating table. So those issues that, as I said before, can be play a kind of model between the China and the United States, moving forward to cooperation. This is my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Go. Before we wrap up, I'm going to ask one last question to our American panelists. It is not like that U.S. demanding countries like South Korea to choose between the U.S. and China. But the policies like 5G Clean Pass, like EPM, made inevitably those countries to make a choice, right? So like UK case in using Huawei parts in the establishing 5G infra network, that we have to make a choice. Then the question is, what kind of alternatives that US is going to provide to other countries when US, maybe force is not a good word, but when US push countries to make a choice in this kind of policies. So how far do you think, if you can share with us, that US is prepared or ready to provide alternatives to the countries like South Korea if they want South Korea and other countries to join their policies toward like China? Can you go first with Michael?
Thank you, and thank you for this forum. It's been very nice to be with you. I would simply say that when you are forced or feel forced to make a choice, sometimes we're right when we ask for your support, but sometimes we're not exactly right, and we can benefit from a dialogue. That's what it means to be allies. That's what it means to be two sovereign countries that are in a mutual security arrangement, and to be two of the top economic and military powers and technological powers on the planet. So as an American, I would say to South Korean friends, please don't give in to us too easily or quickly. And normally what can happen in the course of a dialogue is we can identify a third option, not all China or all US, not completely taking sides, Beijing versus Washington, but something that's true to Korean interests and principles. And it's not always going to be easy. And there will be times where you have to accept a little bit more tension or cost in one relationship versus the other. But it shouldn't be something that we rush you into unless it's a crisis. It should be something that we talk about and we figure out a better way to handle. I'll give one example and stop. In 2004, 2005, the Bush administration wanted Korea to give a form of a blank check for US military operations in the region that was called strategic flexibility. And that would have allowed the United States to use air power based in Korea for a Taiwan contingency, for example. Korea didn't like that idea. I think Koreans were correct. And I know a number of Bush administration officials who now acknowledge that the Bush administration was wrong to request strategic flexibility on the terms that were proposed. And that was an unfortunate period in our alliance. President No and Donald Rumsfeld and others were not getting along particularly well. I hope we don't have too many periods like that. But the United States request needed to be softened, modified, pushed back against, just like when we ask for $5 billion a year in host nation support, maybe some of what we're requesting is okay, but some of it is excessive. So I would simply say, let's have confidence that this alliance is actually an alliance of two powerful, strong, smart countries, and neither one should quickly give in to the other. We should try to find a way to accommodate the core interests of each other. Sometimes that's going to be tough, and sometimes that's going to require trying to find a third option. But please don't let us force you into a situation too quickly where you have to choose between Beijing and Washington. That usually won't be good for us any more than it's good for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And Patricia, please.
I completely agree with Michael that frank dialogue between the two allies is absolutely critical. And so I very much foot stomp that point. And I think there are a lot of questions among analysts in the US who look at this region on, what are the pressures that our allies are facing? What alternatives can the United States bring to the table when it asks allies to make hard choices? And I think it's something that we need to work together through to look for creative solutions. And there's another question of how can the United States support its allies when they face pressure from Chinese economic coercion. And this is something that Beijing often resorts to, like it did to South Korea during the THAAD crisis, like it has towards Australia, now that it's led the charge for investigations at the WHO and so on. And so I think this is where we can use creative ideas from our allies. And so I think dialogues like these, track 2 dialogues where experts can talk together about how the allies can support each other. And of course, official level dialogues will be very important as well.
Thank you. Patrick, please.
All of us, all three of the American delegates here are not in government. So I imagine if we were in government, we'd be having to press a harder line than we're pressing right now with you. We can be very generous from our think tank perches. But I agree with Patricia and Michael. This needs to be a deliberative, serious give and take process. I think our South Korean allies would listen to us much more assiduously if we were serious, if we were focused, if we were transparent, if we were seen to be effective and willing to follow through. And I think there are good reasons to question all of those attributes right now in terms of what we're doing. So it's very important for the United States to be the ally that we also expect our ally to be, not to look for our allies to somehow be doing what we're not doing. So this is a partnership, and the strongest alliance is based on shared interests. So as Michael and Patty were both suggesting, the more we can do to identify exactly where those overlapping interests are and what are most important priorities, I think we'll be able to make those hard decisions going forward. We can't answer them in the abstract, but I'm optimistic that we will make this alliance work and we'll adapt to the new situation as it evolves. We have to do so. It's in our common interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now I'm going to give like 30 seconds to our Korean panelist. Dr. Baek, please.
The one thing I want to tell you is, I think the time of the politics over economy has come. For grabbing economic superiority. That's oxymoron and then ironical. But I think politics is going to be more important and then more dominant. To this bilateral relationship between the United States and China, and then all those middle powers in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baek. Professor Cho, please.
I hope and I expect the globalization will find some equilibrium, even though the level of globalization will go down. Probably the humankind will maintain a certain level of globalization and international interaction. So probably I'm gonna wait a little bit about the Sino-US rivalry, and probably I hope the rivalry will not be as bad as someone expects. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Joe. Lastly, Director General Ko, please.
First of all, thank you for all the participants, the fascinating comments, all the related issues. And then I found this is a very useful for working with the biologics. And then especially, I like the comment that the frank discussions between alliance. And then I know this kind of situation is becoming kind of a new norm, and it kind of trends continue to go. So under this kind of uncertain situations, as a Korean, the government, or as the position of the Korean government, should be more like measured and then more like the current discuss-based cooperation with the United States, our ally. So in that sense, I think this conversation this morning is very much useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General Ko. And with this, I would like to conclude the meeting this morning in Seoul and the late evening in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, everyone, the American panelists and Korean panelists. And once again, I want to thank our audiences joining this morning. So this concludes the meeting of Sejong Institute. Thank you. Bye.
감사합니다.
Thank you.